Welcome, everyone. We're giving just a moment for all of our participants to join. Welcome. Thank you for coming. We're providing just a little bit more time for all of our participants to join. Welcome to Verité's webinar, Forced Labor Enforcement is Brewing, Navigating Legal Risks and Import Bans in the Coffee Sector. Let's take a look at our agenda today.
Thank you, Rachel. So I'm just going to go through the agenda very quickly. First, we're going to give an overview of Verité and the in-depth research that we've done throughout the coffee sector. Then I'll jump into some of the research findings on forced labor risk and expansion and significant implications of forced labor import bans on companies. Then Rachel will talk about why forced labor import bans are so relevant to companies, and will share robust guidance on what companies should do, as well as open source tools to support their efforts. We invite you to submit questions throughout the session through the chat, and we'll answer as many questions as possible at the end. However, questions that we're not able to answer, we'll be responding to on LinkedIn, so please stay tuned. So in terms of Verité, we're an organization that has worked for 30 years now to promote a world where people work under safe, fair, and legal conditions in over 90 countries and with almost 500 clients and funders and partners. So Verité's worked on forced labor since the beginning of our 30-year history. And we actually started working in coffee in 2008, when we were the first organization to do research on indicators of forced labor in the production of 10 goods, including coffee in Guatemala, where I was based at the time and was closely involved in field research. We've done lots of projects in addition to research, such as in-depth grievance mechanisms that were used by over 1,000 workers in coffee in Guatemala, as well as the Coffee Project, where we implemented pilot projects in Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico, and developed an open source toolkit with 42 tools and online training modules that Rachel will get into in a moment. We've also done, we also have lots of other open source tools on forced labor, such as our FLIP Forced Labor Indicators project. So just to get in a little bit more into myself, I'm Verité's Senior Regional Lead for the Americas. I've worked at Verité for over 19 years and have worked in coffee for 17 of those years, and continue to work extensively in that sector. Prior to this current position, I led our applied research practice group. So research has been a huge part of what I do. And I'd like to turn it over to Rachel to introduce herself as well.
Thank you very much, Quinn. My name is Rachel Phillips Rigby, and I lead Verité's practice group on extended supply chains. So that means I lead many of our consulting engagements with companies sourcing agricultural ingredients in global supply chains. And I have been working on labor issues in coffee for nearly 20 years. I'd also like to quickly introduce our colleague, Antonio Rosa, who is here on the webinar with us today. He led Verité's Coffee Project, which was a multi-year grant from the U.S. Department of Labor, and he leads our work on coffee in Brazil.
Thank you, Rachel. So now I'm going to dive into forced labor risks in coffee that have been documented through worker-centered field research by Verité. So as many of you may know, the number of countries in which coffee has been determined to be produced by forced labor or child labor under the DOL, U.S. Department of Labor, list of goods produced with forced labor and child labor. The product that has been produced in the third highest number of countries after gold and sugarcane is coffee. So coffee's already been recognized as being a good that's produced widely with forced labor and child labor. However, that list of good actually misses lots of different countries in which coffee is produced with forced labor because it's based on field research or on desk research. And field research is really necessary to document the risks of forced labor in the coffee sector, as I will be getting into in a moment. So Verité uses a methodology that allows us to uncover cases of forced labor. We interview workers and engage in in-depth interviews, many cases of up to 100 questions outside of workers' workplaces so that they're able to share sensitive information, such as on issues of forced labor, and to engage in in-depth conversations without the risk of reprisals. So Verité has carried out 14 in-depth field research projects in coffee since 2008. So as you can see, those research projects span North, Central, and South America, as well as Africa. And we've actually done multiple investigations in many of these countries across years. So we've been able to see risks evolve over time. Unfortunately, in many cases, we've seen that forced labor risk has not decreased. In many cases, actually increased, related to factors such as COVID, climate change, refugee crises, increased rates of poverty and violence, which make workers even more vulnerable to forced labor. So now I'll talk a little bit about the definition of forced labor and about forced labor indicators. So the International Labor Organization is the body that sets binding international standards on labor issues. And under Convention 29, which has been ratified by the vast majority of countries, forced labor is all work or service which is exacted from any person under the menace of any penalty and for which this person has not offered himself or herself voluntarily. So as you can see, there are two main elements of forced labor. There is involuntary labor and there is menace of penalty, right, or coercion. And you need both of those elements for a case of forced labor to be present. Fortunately, the ILO has developed indicators of forced labor, which are really the specific practices that together result in a case of forced labor. So you need indicators of both coercion and voluntariness. Verité was actually the first organization to operationalize these ILO indicators in 2008 through research in coffee in Guatemala, as well as 9 other products. These indicators are really important because they not only provide a framework for the objective identification of cases of forced labor, but even more importantly, they provide for the identification of concrete intervention points. So forced labor it converts from an amorphous phenomenon that's very hard to identify and open to lots of misperceptions about thinking people have to be locked up for forced labor to occur, to something that you're able to clearly identify. And it also allows for the identification of concrete practices that if you eliminate these practices, you eliminate forced labor. As I'll be getting into later, the US and now in US and EU regulators, when the forced labor import ban in the European Union takes effect, will be using these forced labor indicators to identify forced labor through their investigations. And the US has already clearly, explicitly said that they are doing that. And as you'll see through the following examples, identifying these indicators is only possible by engaging directly with workers. So there are 15 indicators of forced labor that have been identified, developed by the ILO, and Verité has identified 14 of these 15 indicators in coffee amongst many different countries. And I'm going to be giving you a few examples of what these indicators actually look like in practice in coffee. The only indicator we haven't seen is workers being born or sold into slavery, which is sort of the traditional idea of what forced labor looks like. But all these other indicators that I'll be talking about are extremely common across the sector. So in terms of a job of a different nature than promise, which in many cases is also known as deceptive recruitment, it's a huge issue across coffee farms in Latin America, where recruiters deceive workers about their working conditions and their pay, even about where they're going to work. But also, really importantly, many times act as crew leaders who are also responsible for supervising and paying workers. But third-party labor recruiters are also present in other areas of the supply chain, such as in mills and warehouses in Uganda, where deceptive recruitment can also be a problem. There's also the issue of a lack of freedom to terminate contracts. So almost all workers in coffee farms have verbal contracts, but in many cases, in these verbal explanations of what workers' conditions of work are, employers and recruiters don't explain workers' rights, but rather just their obligations. And in many cases, their obligations is to work 90 days or the whole harvest season. And retention of wages and identity documents and other forms of coercion mean that workers can't leave before those contracts are up. We also see degrading living conditions. So it's really important to know that that a lot of these indicators also, again, require talking to workers. It's about workers' perceptions of whether conditions are degrading and how they compare to what they're accustomed to. So we see that in many cases, the housing and food that's provided to workers, they say that it's worse than what they're living in conditions and food at home. And this is really concerning because we do interviews in workers sending communities of migrant workers, and in many cases, we see their living conditions at home. In Guatemala, for example, it's the country in the Western Hemisphere with the second highest rate of malnutrition. And when we interviewed Guatemalan workers, they told us that the quality and quantity of food in the farms to which they migrated within Guatemala was lower than what they ate in their homes. We actually interviewed workers from Guatemala that said that they were migrating to Mexico because of protein. They were given meat one day a week in Mexico, whereas in Guatemala, they were only given beans for every single meal. We actually interviewed workers who said that they had to sleep on the dirt floors. And I remember bringing the head of sustainability for a major coffee company to workers' communities, the communities of workers who migrated from Guatemala to Mexico. And when we asked them through focus group what the biggest change they'd like to see, they said, could you tell the employers to give us a piece of cardboard so we don't have to sleep directly on the dirt floors? So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about degrading living conditions. We also see forced overtime and very low or no wages. So those are both, in many cases, tied to piece rate pay. I recently published a white paper on piece rate pay and how that not only contributes to where workers are paid according to the amount of coffee harvested, and how that not only corresponds to sub-minimum wages, let alone living wages, which are far from being a reality in coffee, but also workers having to work far in excess of legal limits of working hours in order to earn enough to survive. Now I'm going to move on to indicators of coercion. So we have the withholding of wages, with many workers not paid until the end of their contracts or the end of the coffee harvest, which means in many cases they don't want to leave because they haven't received their payment, and they may be unable to leave because they don't have money to actually cover their transportation back to their communities. In addition, we see restrictions on workers' freedom of movement. So in Brazil, we saw, for example, that many workers couldn't leave their jobs and return home whenever they wanted. And those living on farms had limited freedom to leave. Often transportation was only made available to buy groceries. We also have debt bondage. So it's interesting that in many cases, debt bondage, people think it's only related to recruitment fees, but we see in coffee, even more so than recruitment fees, we see debt indebtedness to company stores. So in many cases, workers actually aren't provided with transport even to buy groceries, and they have to buy goods in inflated prices to company stores located on the farms, to which they become indebted. And because the amount of food that's provided is so low, they end up having to buy supplementary food at inflated prices, which creates a cycle of debt, especially if they're not paid until the end of the harvest, meaning they can't pay off that debt and they can't leave. We also see withholding of documents. There's also a misperception that that's only relevant to international immigrants, but we actually see a lot of internal migrant workers whose documents are withheld. And lots of times these documents are really important. For example, the Documento Personal de Identificación or personal identification document in Guatemala is necessary to file legal complaints against employers, to do any kind of bank transactions. In Brazil, the Carteira de Trabalho is sort of it's a formal resume that is necessary to get jobs and to obtain benefits. So there's also the denial of rights and privileges and threats of dismissal and deportation. So we've seen, for example, in Guatemala, there's a use of blacklisting of workers who complain, meaning that they can't get other jobs. In Colombia, we see the denial of food or transport home if workers don't work an entire day. In Honduras, there's over 100,000 Guatemalan migrant workers working in Honduras, migrating to a country with even higher rates of poverty and violence than in Guatemala, which creates a huge risk. And in the US, there's lots of undocumented workers in Hawaii, for example, and under the H-2A visa program, the rules allow for workers to be deported if they switch employers because the implementation of the modernizing H-2 program has been suspended. So you have all of these risks that are present in the coffee sector, all these different ILO indicators of forced labor, which can only be detected through field research in many cases. Just think about all of these indicators that I just mentioned. The vast majority, you can only determine whether they exist by having in-depth conversation with workers. There's not visually verifiable. Think about deceptive recruitment, working for a longer time than agreed, inability to leave jobs, forced overtime, withholding of wages, threats of violence, debt bondage, document retention, threats of dismissal and deportation. You can only identify these by talking with workers and doing so in environments in which they feel free to share this kind of sensitive information without reprisals. So in many cases, outside of workplaces. And desk research can be really misleading and create an echo chamber effect. Many times when I've seen desk-based risk screenings, it's sort of flipped on its head from what we've actually identified in the field. In many cases, the countries where the government has been exposing forced labor risks, where the press is involved, where NGOs have been exposing forced labor risks, those are the countries where the government, press, and NGOs are most active in identifying and addressing these risks. Whereas in other countries, nobody's on the ground actually talking with workers and identifying risks. So these risks fester under the surface, right? Desk research is not an effective tool in many cases to identify these risks. And the same goes even with expert interviews. There are very few quote unquote experts who actually talk to workers about their experiences. And the same goes for many audits and certifications, which might not have standards that cover these specific practices that are indicators of forced labor, maybe just a broad prohibition on forced labor. And again, don't engage in a significant number of interviews and don't conduct interviews off-site with workers. So I'm going to now talk about forced labor import bans. We've talked about all these risks to workers, and now let's talk about risks to business. The fact that these forced labor indicators are so widespread is extremely important to companies because the US and shortly the EU and other countries will be using these indicators in investigations to determine whether forced labor is present to enforce forced labor import bans, which have now become the biggest human rights related legal risk for companies. So we've seen that forced labor import bans are expanding globally at a rapid pace. This is what things look like now. But think about what things will look like in a couple of years or even just a couple of months. As in the last month alone, 9 countries have made commitments to pass forced labor import bans. The US was the first country to pass the forced labor import ban going back all the way to 1930. But an important loophole was closed in 2015 through the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act, and which really has resulted in enforcement being significantly ramped up. Forced labor import bans are central to the trade agenda of the current administration, and they're being advanced by the US in negotiations and on trade agreements with various countries. Earlier this year, the US agreed through trade discussions to deepen cooperation on removing forced labor from global supply chains with the EU, which has already adopted its forced labor regulation, which will go into full effect in 2027, and the UK, which is working on a forced labor import ban right now. The US, Mexico, and Canada have all passed forced labor import bans, with the Mexico and Canada doing so under the USMCA trade agreement. And this year, those three countries will convene for tripartite labor discussions under the USMCA. And forced labor import bans are going to be a key topic, and they're looking to strengthen cooperation on this topic. So recently, we've also seen Australia, Malaysia, Cambodia, Indonesia, and South Korea over the last couple of months announced commitments to pass forced labor import bans. And just in the last week, we saw that commitment from Guatemala and El Salvador, which are important coffee producers in their own right, as well as Ecuador and Argentina, which will integrate forced labor import bans into reciprocal trade agreements with the US. So I'm going to get into more detail now about the specifics of forced labor import bans in the US and the EU, especially since they're the ones that are far along with this, and they are the two most important markets for coffee. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the key differences between Section 307 of the Tariffs Act, which regulates these forced labor import bans, as well as the EU Forced Labor Regulation, or EU FLR. So under Section 307, goods, wares, articles, and merchandise made in whole or in part with forced labor or forced prison labor in a foreign country can be prohibited from entering the US. It's really important to note that it's goods that are made in whole or in part, which means that it's not just coffee, right, but could also be goods that have coffee as an ingredient. And in the EU, an important distinction is that it's not only about goods that are imported into the EU, but also goods that are traded within the European Union between different countries or exported from the European market. In terms of enforcement, the US Customs and Border Patrol is the primary body responsible for issuing withhold release orders under Section 307. While in the EU, the member states also have a role to play. And so in terms of enforcement, it's important to mention that enforcement has really ramped up over the last couple of years, and especially over the last year. So we're seeing just an acceleration of investigations and issuance of withhold release orders, which are WROs, which are used to prohibit to seize shipments of goods at port, and are the primary enforcement tool used to block goods suspected of being made with forced labor. We've also seen a huge increase in petitions that have been filed by by civil society organizations to initiate investigations by CBP, and CBP also reaching out to companies and civil society and others and doing their own investigations that are not initiated by petitions. In terms of these investigations, in the EU, the investigations are based on a human rights due diligence logic. Well, in the US, the approach is much more opaque. As I mentioned, EU FLR will come into full effect in 2027. So there's a little less information on what investigations will look like in practice. But from the legislation and conversations with the European Commission, we know that companies will be involved throughout the process. And they'll be invited to share information and, really importantly, encouraged to identify, prevent, mitigate, and remediate risks through this kind of human rights due diligence framework that Rachel will get more into. So I'll get into to more detail on the US investigations, because the process, again, is more opaque and further along. So investigations can be initiated either by CBP directly or in response to public petitions that are filed. It's important to note that the evidentiary standard is very low. It's based on reasonable suspicion or probable cause. And the detainment process begins with the issuance of a WRO. And if the review finds evidence of forced labor, CBP can issue a finding that can lead to the seizure and forfeiture proceedings, which can include fines, and importers may not re-export the shipment. Finally, the burden of proof to lift in a forced labor import ban in the U.S. It falls on companies, and which have to appeal to get WROs lifted. And importers may request a review of the decision by providing evidence showing the good was not produced with forced labor. And to lift a ban, companies also have to show that this was remediated. So that really important for companies to have all of their ducks in a row to be able to respond if something like this happens. Whereas in the EU, companies are involved throughout the process and invited to share information and encouraged to identify those risks, as I said. It's also really important to note that the impacts of forced labor import bans on business. So the effects on companies go much deeper than just the retention of shipments of coffee. There are legal and compliance costs. In addition to the fines I just mentioned, there are the actual legal costs, as well as the cost of remediation, which is always more expensive than prevention. For example, it's always better to ensure that suppliers are covering recruitment costs rather than having to reimburse thousands of workers for recruitment fees that they've paid. Reputational damage leads not only to lost sales and a loss of consumers who are very concerned about social issues. A recent survey by the NCA and SCA found that that social issues and labor issues specifically constitute 3 out of 5 of the issues that are most important to consumers, even surpassing things like the type of coffee, Arabica versus Robusta, in their decisions about what coffee to buy and how much they're willing to spend. But it also means losing client relationships. So many clients have their own standards on forced labor and could themselves be exposed to legal and reputational risk because of being tied to a company that's imported coffee produced with forced labor. And so this can lead to a loss of major clients. It can also, in the case of the EU, result in a loss of a license to operate. So companies can actually be temporarily prohibited from trading in goods that have been found to be produced with forced labor. So imagine your company being prohibited from importing coffee into the EU, one of 2 of the most important coffee markets in the world. Seizure, WROs, for example, can result in supply chain disruptions, right? So we already saw this with COVID, how important delays in shipments can be and how they can have ripple effects across the entire supply chain. So as you see, and I've shared some of the risks that we've documented of forced labor across the coffee sector, which are extremely severe, as well as why, in addition to having severe effects on workers, why this creates severe legal and reputational risks and legal and compliance costs for companies. Now I'll turn it over to Rachel for an example of how a company responded to a WRO.
Thank you so much, Quinn. As Quinn noted, forced labor enforcement actions can really have a major impact on business. At the same time, import bans can spur companies to take the issue of forced labor seriously and put in place the systems necessary to mitigate risks and prevent forced labor. So I'd like to share an example from a few years ago of CBP enforcement on an agricultural import. Malawi is a small country in southern Africa, and it has been among the top 10 producers of tobacco in recent decades. It's a relatively under-resourced country, and the tobacco sector has many smallholder farmers, so in some ways there are some parallels with coffee. Around 2010, Verité began working with a major global buyer of tobacco leaf to develop that company's farm labor due diligence systems for its tobacco supply chains. That work included training and building the capacity of the company's 2 suppliers in Malawi to carry out strong due diligence. So that was several years before CBP began enforcing the forced labor import bans in 2015, following the removal of the loophole from that law. Then in 2019, CBP issued a WRO on all tobacco from Malawi based on evidence of widespread forced labor practices. As part of their usual process, they required all importers of tobacco to show evidence that their tobacco was not produced by forced labor. And the first companies to be exempted from the WRO in 2020 were the two that we had worked with. They were able to provide evidence that they had mature due diligence systems in place. To date, only one additional company has been exempted from that WRO in 2021, and that was only a partial release. So to be clear, Verité was not directly involved in those two companies' engagements with CBP, but we were gratified to see that the due diligence systems that we had helped them build were considered sufficient evidence to release them from the WRO. The point that this example illustrates is be ready. The moment when your goods are stopped at the border is not the moment to start thinking about due diligence. Now is the time to prepare. So that example was from the tobacco sector, but what does all this mean for coffee companies? Let's start with the US. So, after several years of mostly focusing on enforcement of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, it appears that CBP is more focused now on Section 307 enforcement. Recently, we have seen WROs on bicycles from Taiwan and garments, apparel, and textiles from Mauritius just yesterday. Both of these were issued on specific importing companies, not on an entire sector in the exporting country, as was the case in Malawi. As Quinn mentioned earlier, CBP can initiate investigations in response to public petitions. And we know that at least one petition has been submitted to CBP about alleged forced labor in coffee production in Brazil. Of course, this does not necessarily mean there will be a WRO in coffee. CBP has indicated that a lot of the petitions they receive are not necessarily actionable for investigation or detention, but this is something that coffee companies should continue to watch. And in Europe, of course, the forced labor regulation is not yet in force, and it's too early to tell really anything about enforcement related to coffee. But coffee is a hugely important sector for Europe and one that is frequently in the spotlight for all kinds of sustainability concerns. So it certainly will be a sector of focus for media attention, NGO campaigns, and so forth. And that's yet another reason to be prepared. And here you can just see, this gives you a sense of the scrutiny on coffee, some snapshots from recent NGO and media reporting. So what should coffee companies do? Let's start with guidance coming directly from the regulatory agencies themselves. So enforcement guidance does continue to evolve across jurisdictions. This past summer, CBP published long-awaited guidance for companies seeking exemption or modification of WROs. You can see this on the left side of the slide. The guidance explicitly references Verité's responsible sourcing tool, which we produced with grant funds from the U.S. Department of State. You can see a snapshot of that on the right, and that does contain guidance on human rights due diligence, consistent with all other Verité guidance. In the EU, additional guidance for companies on the EU forced labor regulation requirements is due to come out in June 2026. So we all look forward to that. One thing is clear. Despite differences across the regulations, all of the jurisdictions that have enacted bans, so that's the US, Canada, Mexico, and the European Union so far, with more to come, they all encourage companies to rely on the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development's Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises as a foundational framework for due diligence. You can see the OECD framework on the left here. And on the right, you can see CBP's Identify, Correct, and Prevent framework, which has a similar structure and is clearly aligned with the OECD. And here is Verité's Farm Labor Due Diligence Framework, which also uses the OECD guidelines as its foundation. This framework goes the extra step of tailoring our general human rights due diligence guidance specifically for agricultural supply chains, with a focus on farm workers, which is really what makes it unique. We developed our approach to farm labor due diligence over the course of several years as we worked with companies to put in place these practices in their supply chains. These company partners included the global tobacco buyer I referenced before in the Malawi example. The systems we put in place with those Malawi tobacco suppliers are now built into our farm labor due diligence toolkit. So as you can see reflected here, we at Verité really believe that human rights due diligence must be comprehensive, Every one of these 6 elements and 23 components is important to due diligence. I know it's a lot, but they are all important. In recent years, as companies have been starting to get a handle on human rights due diligence, we've seen progress in some areas. For example, many companies are doing the first component that you see listed, human rights policies and codes of conduct. Many are doing internal training. Many are doing saliency assessments. Many are doing auditing, which is one type of monitoring. But there are other areas where we have not really seen a critical mass of companies making progress. So those are areas like in-depth analysis of root causes or capability building all along the supply chain. We do see quite a few companies working on grievance mechanisms, but grievance mechanisms are not truly effective without meaningful, impactful remediation of the complaints and harms that are reported to them. And remediation is an area where many companies are not very mature yet in their due diligence. We understand that most companies are not yet implementing all of these components. This is really complex work that takes years to develop, but we do encourage them to start and to make continuous improvement in all the areas. So I'd like to take a closer look with you at some specific due diligence activities that we think are particularly important for coffee companies. So once you have identified the main salient human rights issues in your coffee supply chains, you will need further information on those risks. You really can't fix what you don't understand, and facts are foundational for action. And there are 2 types of assessments that I'd like to highlight here. First, the country and supply chain assessments. These are the type of research that Quinn was mentioning earlier. So field research that really capture various kinds of forced labor risk. They gather information directly from a diverse range of workers, and they gain a nuanced picture of the ways that risk can vary across geographies, different sizes of farms, and other factors, and they look at root causes. So that's the kind of research that will yield the type of rich insight that Quinn presented at the top of the webinar. And then you, of course, have workplace assessments, which can be referred to as audits, or they have other names. And there are really good ways and not so good ways to do workplace assessments. Quinn mentioned some of the poorer practices, like assessments that might not have many or any worker interviews or might not do worker interviews the right way. What we think needs to be done is that data needs to be triangulated between confidential worker interviews, management interviews, document reviews, on-site observations. Forced labor should always be assessed against international forced labor indicators, applying the ILO framework that we presented earlier, and root cause analysis. So some compliance programs or some auditing systems just simply have one compliance point on forced labor, and that just won't cut it because there's so many different kinds of forced labor. There's so many indicators of forced labor. The auditor just needs to look deeper. And it should be worker-centered, context-specific risk evaluation, looking at migration pathways and other factors. Also, I will say that when it comes to workplace assessments, the skills of the auditor in interviewing workers are really critical. You know, they need to know how to talk about these sensitive issues in the right way. The next issue I'd like to cover is building capacity across your supply chain to address forced labor risk. So this training needs to be far-reaching in order to really be effective. Pardon me. We see plenty of companies doing training, but in coffee supply chains, it is not enough to just train first-tier suppliers, which is what we see many companies doing. All of the learner groups on this slide need training on human rights issues, and each group should be trained based on their learning needs, gaps, and specific role in identifying, preventing, and mitigating risks. So that includes your own team, your first-tier suppliers, the field technicians or agronomists that either you have or your suppliers have, or you've engaged third parties to go to farms and engage with farmers. There needs to be training for farmers directly, labor recruiters, if there are labor recruiters involved in bringing workers to the farms, they need some training and capacity building, the workers themselves, and then, as I mentioned earlier, the auditors that might be the ones checking compliance points on the farm. So each one of these needs specialized training according to their learning needs. Let me just give you one example. Field technicians and agronomists. So they would need clear explanations of forced labor risks and prohibited practices, and those should be detailed. They should go into the indicators that Quinn mentioned earlier. What are the types of things that are and are not allowed on this farm? Then how to spot red flags on farm that may indicate forced labor risk. And finally, how to interview farmers and workers to identify those forced labor risks. All of those skills are really key and they need to be taught. They aren't necessarily things that field technicians or agronomists know right off the bat. Um, I'd like you, I'd invite you to take a look at our free coffee toolkit, which has a guide on communication and training across coffee supply chains. That's part of our overall coffee um, toolkit that for which we received funding from the U.S. Department of Labor. The third topic I'd like to cover is grievance mechanisms. So it's important for companies to really invest in grievance mechanisms that work for coffee. Um, this is one of the hottest topics in due diligence. Every due diligence law includes a requirement to have a grievance or complaint mechanism. And when it comes to due diligence for forced labor in particular, grievance mechanisms are important because farm monitoring and auditing can often miss signs of forced labor risk. So providing channels for workers and other affected stakeholders to raise their concerns provides an alternative when audits fail. What have we seen working well in terms of grievance mechanisms in the coffee sector? Good practices do vary depending on a lot of factors, such as culture. In coffee, they definitely vary by farm type. So when it comes to large farms and coffee estates, a grievance mechanism needs to have clear buy-in and support from senior management, clear roles and responsibilities among management and staff. It can sometimes be effective to outsource the grievance mechanism to a qualified local provider if they, if they know what they're doing and have been proven to operate good grievance mechanisms for other clients. There should always be multiple channels for submission of complaints, um, structured processes for reviewing, handling, and resolving issues, sufficient resources, and then, of course, clear communication with workers about how the grievance mechanism operates and how to access it. When it comes to smallholder farms, the approach will be different. Individual smallholder farmers obviously cannot be responsible for having their own grievance mechanisms. That doesn't make sense. So it's often most effective for the grievance mechanism to be based in a farmer group or a cooperative. It's still true that there should be multiple channels available for submission of complaints, and that can include trusted farmers and or community members. The cooperatives really have a challenge of communicating the grievance mechanism to both the farmer members and the workers on those farmers. This is often a very dispersed landscape with a lot of farmers and workers that come and go. So that's one of the biggest challenges for grievance mechanisms in a smallholder environment. But training of all actors is really key. The co-op staff should understand their roles and responsibilities. The farmers should understand how to access that grievance mechanism and what they need to tell workers so that workers can access it. And then the workers themselves need to be trained on how to use it, or information needs to reach them somehow on how to use it. And we're seeing innovative ways of reaching workers with that information. Well, finally, as I mentioned earlier, a grievance mechanism really can't be considered effective if the issues raised to the grievance mechanism or issues raised other ways are not remediated effectively. So recall the forced labor indicators that Quinn presented earlier. Document retention, fraudulent recruitment, physical confinement, underpayment or delayed wages, abusive overtime requirements, debt bondage, sexual harassment, verbal abuse, violence, degrading living conditions. All of these are indicators of forced labor. And there are good practice ways to remediate each one of these. Remediation of any indicator should always include remedy for the affected stakeholder and also measures to prevent the recurrence of that issue. So, for example, in the case of underpayment or delayed wages, the affected stakeholder should be immediately paid any unpaid or delayed wages due, including unallowed deductions. And if immediate repayment is not possible, maybe the farmer has a cash flow issue, as you often see in coffee, there should be a time-bound plan established for repayment with a responsible party for overseeing that repayment is made as timely as possible. And to prevent recurrence, either the farm or the co-op needs to change its policies and practices on the timing and frequency of payment, perhaps, if those policies and practices were not in place. There need to be better pay records and pay slips for workers and other pay-related issues as needed. And labor recruiters need to be trained, supervisors, crew leaders, and workers on pay-related policies and practices so that everyone is aware of the workers' rights in that situation and can report deficiencies going forward. And again, I'd like to invite you to take a look at our free coffee toolkit, which has a guide on response and remedy. So we are nearing the end of our presentation today. These are the key takeaways we'd like to leave you with. Takeaway 1, forced labor risk is present in every coffee origin and could affect any given supply chain. Forced labor should always be considered a salient human rights risk in coffee, no matter the origin. Takeaway 2, regulatory scrutiny on the coffee sector is increasing, and action on forced labor is shifting from voluntary to mandatory. Takeaway 3, strong due diligence on forced labor and other human rights issues is the best way to mitigate risk and have a positive impact on vulnerable workers. And finally, takeaway 4, human rights due diligence is not just monitoring, it's so much more, as I showed on that slide with 6 elements and 23 components. It includes full remediation, meaningful stakeholder engagement, continuous improvement, and other elements. And that is what we would like to leave you with. And now we will be happy to take questions. Quinn, over to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Rachel. So yeah, as Rachel mentioned, we'll be reviewing some of the questions that were submitted through the chat. Please feel free if you have other questions to submit those now, and people can pass them on to us, again, for addressing them today or through our social media posts. So I'm going to go through a couple of questions that were submitted, and then I will turn it over to Rachel, who will be answering a couple of other questions. So the first question that was submitted was, I'm curious if Verité is an overview across all or most coffee origins that sheds light on the degree and or level of risk related to forced labor, perhaps with indications of types or manifestations across different origins. A big ask, I know, but the coffee sector is rather light on documentation on this topic. So really, really good question. And I know that this is, it's challenging, right? That there isn't a lot of published research. Of course, you may find things that are published in specific countries. Brazil is an example. There's lots of research that's published on Brazil. The issue is that that doesn't necessarily mean that the conditions in Brazil are worse than in other countries. It means that you have a government that is doing labor inspections, publishing data from inspections, publishing a dirty list. You have civil society that's active on the topic. You have press that's active on the topic. That's not the case in many countries, but we've seen in many countries that the forced labor indicators are actually worse than in Brazil. There are certainly issues that are still present, but it's really important not to just base your decisions on what has been published. We've seen there are many countries where there are 0 reports on forced labor, 0 research that's been done, and the conditions are really worsened because there's been no exposure. Companies aren't doing remediation. Government's not working on this. You don't have civil society working on it, so it just continues in the dark and unaddressed. In terms of your question, unfortunately, much of our research has been carried out both for government or foundation funded funders under projects. So we use our research in many cases, even 300 worker interviews, to develop things like a grievance mechanism. But we don't necessarily publish that research. We also do lots of confidential in-depth field research for companies in their sourcing footprints, which is really important to inform company decisions, right? Where they're going to invest their resources, because again, desk-based risk screenings can be really misleading. And if you're investing huge amounts of money in origins that are actually lower risk because things have been exposed and are being addressed, then you're really missing the ball. And because CBP is going to be proactively looking for these forced labor indicators. The EU will be looking for forced labor indicators and will be receiving petitions and doing their own investigation. It's really important for companies to understand where their exposure is in their supply chains. Um, but we have released detailed reports, such as the report on indicators of forced labor in the Guatemalan coffee sector, which is from 2012, but it's super detailed. It's like 100 pages, but it's actually still relevant because, unfortunately, our ongoing research, not only in Guatemala but in many other countries throughout Latin America, has found that these indicators are still present across many countries and even getting worse in many cases. So it's sort of reflective of the types of indicators you see in the coffee sector more broadly in Latin America. The Coffee Project Toolkit also has some really good training videos on forced labor and forced labor indicators, which we've actually developed not only for companies, but also to be disseminated to suppliers and even to smallholder farmers that are available in English, Spanish, and Portuguese that go through the types of forced labor indicators that are common across Latin America, as well as the types of sort of the definition of forced labor more broadly. And we also recently published two white papers, the one that I already mentioned on piece rate pay, but also one on recruitment practices, labor migration, and labor shortages that really get at some of the main root causes of forced labor throughout the coffee sector that can also be quite useful in creating programs to get at those root causes and reduce the risk of forced labor in company supply chains. And the second question that's most relevant for me is if CBP issues a WRO, which is a withhold release order, against one producer, should we expect this to expand into a countrywide prohibition for that commodity? So this is a really good question. And it's not usually the case that you have a countrywide prohibition on the import of goods produced with forced labor. But there have been cases. For example, you could see the case of cotton from Uzbekistan, in which forced labor risk was determined to be so widespread that all cotton from the country was subject to a WRO. So there is certainly precedence for that. CBP could determine that forced labor risk across a specific sector is so widespread that all coffee from that specific country should be prohibited from entering the U.S. market. That's not generally the case, but that is a possibility. In most cases, it's actually specific shipments that are withheld, and specific suppliers or traders or importers or companies that are importing those products that are named, right? And so again, as I mentioned earlier, that can mean fines, that can mean the legal costs, the severe reputational damage, and then also in the case of the EU, when the legislation fully comes into place, potentially that loss of a license to operate, which in essence could mean that a company would be prohibited from importing all coffee from all countries into the EU for a time, which can be if you're a coffee company and that's your commodity, that is just a huge economic blow. So there are now a couple of questions for Rachel that I will turn it over to her so she has time to answer as well.
Thank you, Quinn. Great questions are coming in. Thank you to the audience as well for those. The first one is, what impact does informing or training workers about their decent work rights have in forced labor risk situations? Does it lead to concrete improvements, or is it more effective to focus on training the actors with greater power in the system, like recruiters, intermediaries, and companies? Which pathways have you found most impactful? Yeah, really great question. So when I was talking about training and capacity building earlier, I mentioned that there are all these different learner audiences that need to be trained, and the training needs to be kind of nested together so that the different audiences are learning some of the same material, but also learning what their role is in fixing the problem. And typically, we work with clients on sort of a cascade basis. So they start by training their own people about their roles. What is forced labor? What are their roles and responsibilities? Then training their suppliers and making sure the suppliers understand this is your responsibility to train the next level down the chain. And in many cases, that is farmers or cooperatives. So make sure they're getting the right training and then making sure those farmers or cooperatives understand their roles in training workers. And that could mean training on all kinds of things, the workers' rights, the workers' ability to access grievance mechanisms, et cetera. Um, One thing you don't want to do is sort of train workers about their rights and how they can access grievance mechanisms and that sort of thing if those systems are not yet set up. Because this question is absolutely right. The workers are the ones in the whole system with the least power. And it's risky for them to raise complaints to a system that doesn't work. So really, you have to have a cascaded and nested approach where everyone understands their obligations and the requirements that they need to uphold, so that when workers um, try to exercise their rights, there are systems in place to respond, and the protections for workers are in place. So I wouldn't say that I don't think you can pick and choose one or two audiences. They're all important, and the training all has to be linked together. But what I will say is that's a lot of training, and that's a big investment for a company. And so this is something that just can be done over time with a continuous improvement approach. And as we always say about due diligence, everything doesn't need to happen at once. Pick your greatest risks. You focus on those, invest in those, and then have a long-term plan for how you're going to continue to improve. Um, The second question is, when we talk about forced labor risks, does that encompass what we would typically track as human trafficking or modern slavery indicators? Or are there distinctions in how these terms are being applied in this context? There are different definitions of forced labor versus human trafficking versus modern slavery, absolutely. But and the indicators that Quinn shared are explicitly forced labor indicators under the ILO typology. But many of the things that he talked about, like deceptive recruitment or debt bondage, are very much linked to human trafficking and modern slavery. And the actions that you need to take in response are the same. So we don't use those words interchangeably exactly, but a lot of the concepts are similar, and the things we've talked about today on the webinar are equally applicable for human trafficking and modern slavery risks. Sometimes it just depends on the jurisdiction and what word is more commonly used. Um, so another question that has come in is, can I please comment, or can we please comment on the role of enforceable brand agreements or global framework agreements in addressing forced labor in the coffee sector? So for those who don't know, brand agreements and global framework agreements are agreements between different multi-stakeholder parties, often with unions or worker groups involved, that agree to broad level commitments that then apply to all the companies or operators in the sector. And I think, as far as I know, there are not any in place in the coffee sector, but these are agreements and frameworks that have really shown positive results in other sectors. So I think we would be inclined to be supportive of efforts in that regard in the coffee sector too. But I guess I would invite the questioner to follow up with one of us directly and talk more to talk more about that possibility. Um, I'm just scanning through the questions here.
Yeah. If you want, Rachel, I can take just this last question.
Sure.
There was a question on whether we have specific guidance on grievance mechanisms when working with global supply chains. When working with so many farm types and countries, it's difficult to find common requirements for a grievance mechanism that's accessible and culturally relevant. So I can just give very quickly an example of a grievance mechanism that we rolled out in the coffee sector with funding from the U.S. Department of State and Keurig Green Mountain back in the day, now Keurig Dr. Pepper. Um, we implemented a grievance mechanism that was ultimately utilized by more than 1,000 workers in the Guatemalan coffee sector. And I think that the key finding there was that it's important to develop sector-wide grievance mechanisms, not just workplace-focused grievance mechanisms, and that a needs assessment, a robust needs assessment, was extremely helpful at the beginning to determine workers' levels of literacy, languages, technology access. Because we ultimately implemented a grievance mechanism that was in Spanish and 3 indigenous languages, and outreach directly to workers' communities, and had a hotline rather than a text or app-based system based on the low levels of literacy and language fluency of the workers. And that's why this was so successful, that it wasn't a one-size-fits-all approach. It was tailored to the context of a specific country and worker population. So again, people, please, hit us up if you have specific questions. We'd be, very happy to follow it up, to follow up on anything specific. Here are our emails. You're welcome to email me if you have other questions, and if there are questions that haven't been addressed, we'll look to post on social media for some of those. So thank you so much for joining. We really appreciate your time, and look forward to continued conversations with many of you.
Thank you, everyone.